Alright, gamers, it's time for a new edition of Unused Content in Gaming, and today we're continuing with Pokemon Black and White, starting off with the Pokemon sprites. Now, I asked at the end of the previous episode if y'all could guess what Pokemon this is. Well, you've had enough time to guess, spoiler alert, that's Beta Meloetta. Looks more like a bug type, weirdly enough. But anyways, let us begin. But before we truly begin, I do give content like this all the time, so if that's the type of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel for free. You can always change your mind later on. Anyways, here are some overworld sprites. I would guess that some of these are reused from Heart Gold Soul Silver. And from Diamond and Pearl as well, I guess. Mostly from Heart Gold Soul Silver, though. Alright, we got this generic female and male character over here, and then we got a Pikachu sprite. The only change was a slight shading adjustment on its legs from the front-facing walking sprite. These sprites are a little too small to purposely see. So, even it going down here, I'm always, like, normally I would click on these to show a bigger picture, but there's so many of these that, oh, that we could still kind of do something like this, but I won't do that for every single one of them. Alright, sprites were shifted up for the final, presumably, to make it appear to float. Alright, that is unused sprites. Got one of Hilbert's early designs. The second scratch pad is an alternate unused palette merged into it to ease, viewing the extra sprite present in it. First proper scratch pad of shown includes some earlier sprites, four of it at the bottom with a differently shaped cloud coming out of it. It looks slightly different, I'd say. Just slightly. Alright, early portrait sprites. Alright, second scratch pad contains some earlier. Yeah, it says very similar things with a fairly different posture. Probably. Alright, scratch pad contains some early sprites below the used ones, featuring different tail positioning and body proportions. Gino over here, next up Petalil. The second scratch pad has an alternate unused palette merged into it for ease of viewing the extra sprites. Sprites were finalized straight away. No revisions were found. Alright, next up we have Crocorock's unused sprites, and it uses Gabite's Gen 4 sprites as a placeholder, it looks like. Alright, you know that extra part. Our Gabite is present on the scratch pad, which may have been used as a reference. Some earlier sprites of Crocorock can be seen below, with some of the back-facing sprites having different details on the back and the tail in different positions. Does look a little different, yes, if you look very closely. Alright, we have Deerling's unused sprites for its, what am I calling, for its spring form, or its different forms. This may intend that maybe following Pokemon was meant to be in Black and White. So we got a beta Deerling sprite over here too that looks significantly different to the final design. Alright, the second to last scratch pad has its alternate unused palette merged into it for ease of viewing the extra sprites. The first set of sprites are fairly rough, lacking a lot of detail and being off model. First revisions make them all a lot smaller, but final brings them back to their previous size. Alright, we got Zenmo Darmanitan over here, and once again with some unused sprites. An earlier, smaller design is featured in one scratch pad. Like that. Kind of looks like a doll of some sort. Some early sprites are present at the bottom with minor details. Also present is an unused alternate palette that gives it lighter fur. Right over here with this unused Zoro over here. Looks more gray than black now. The black looks better. Alright, unused Zoro sprites. Zoroku was completely removed from the game on the overworld. Later on used in the game's sequel, though. Have a whole bunch of sprites made that would eventually get used in Black and White 2, as I said. It was also has the same alternate unused palette that gives it lighter fur. Next up, Petalil and Kandi. Weirdly enough, Petalil and Kandi's color scheme. The second scratch pad has its alternate unused palettes merged in for ease of viewing. The extra sprites. All the sprites were moved out of the bin in the final, and some had their sides, leaves, adjusted slightly. Very slightly. It's kind of hard to see. Now, you could probably guess these are unused sprites over here of all these guys. Well, I'll spoil it for those who don't already know. This is Beta Genesect. That's Beta Victini. Looks more like its shiny form, that we still don't have to this day at the time we're recording this video. This is Tornadus, Landorus, and Thundurus. Or Thundurus, whatever. Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus. This is Beta Zekrom. This is Beta Reshiram. There's the Swords of Justice over here. We already mentioned Meloetta earlier. And finally, fun fact, this is actually Beta Kyurem. In my opinion, when I first saw this thing, it kind of looks like a Monster Hunter monster. Am I the one who thinks that? We'll see some other sprites of it in later episodes, but for now. The second scratch pad has an alternate unused palette merged into it for ease of viewing. The extra sprites, I already know that, originally housed overworld sprites of Genesect's blue color prototype design. The events in the game involving Genesect never have it appear in the overworld, so, because it's an event Pokemon, so these weren't needed. They replaced with Volcarona sprites in the final game, seeing as Volcarona is obtainable in Relic Castle in the overworld. Does that suggest Genesec was originally going to have an event like that, which I think it kind of did in Black and White too, but like a limited time event? Alright, Unused. Alright, so for Victini, I originally had Victini's prototype white design, which later became its shiny, which doesn't appear to depict its wings at all. There also appears to be walking sprites for Victini in the first scratch pad to feature its final colors. After some detailed tweaks, the sprites would also be redrawn much smaller for the final game. Alright, now we have Reshiram in its final design, or at least closer to its final design here, since the sprite looks a little different. I can scroll to the side as well to see some other sprites. Since it doesn't look like there's any dialogue, let's just blow past these. We have more of the beta sprites with different color schemes over here. See if we can get a closer look at these. Yeah, we can. Alright, Reshiram and Zekrom end up getting the most amount of sprites and revisions, of course, being the title legendary Pokemon. These paths originally had Reshiram with its prototype design before starting to slowly shift over to its final one. Its sprite and scratch pads would end up getting much larger, and more unique and dynamic sprites would be added besides it just standing there. Many of these cutscenes sprites can be seen, and how they evolved over about 5 months of development. Alright, even more new sprites for Reshiram over here, suggesting that maybe we're supposed to get overworld walking Pokemon as well, at least that's my guess. Alright, now we have some for Zekrom over here. Let's get a little bit of a closer look at them. Alright, this one would end up being used for its flying animation. Initially used Zekrom sprites as placeholders, or on accident, probably as placeholders. Could be on accident, though. Alright, now we have more of Zekrom sprites. Let's get a closer look. We even got some of Zekrom's beta design over here. Alright, more of those unused sprites over here. Let's get a little bit of a closer look at that. But once again, with the wrong color schemes. I kind of wish they kept Beta Kyurem's design. I almost like that more than the final design. Almost. Alright, ditto to pretty much everything noted for Reshiram sprites. Zekrom's prototype design was featured early on in these pads, before it swapped over to the final design and began getting many new dynamics sprites made for it and its appearance in cutscenes. Alright, I guess these are the different time frames of when these were made. Very courteous of the devs to put those in. Alright, let's get a closer look at these. Alright, animation evolution of sprites used for its roar. Interestingly, some diagonal sprites of it can be seen in a few revisions. While no sprite like it were made for Reshiram. Maybe they only wanted to test it out for Zekrom, who knows. Alright, notice how, well, we got some sprites for Kyurem's final design. But still some of its beta designs here, and then they were leading closer into its final design. Notice how Reshiram and Zekrom are over here. Perhaps initially they were going to have the fusion mechanic for those two in the first game, who knows. Originally featured Kyurem's completely different prototype design before solely was redrawn for the final game. As you see here, let's get a closer look at these. Reshiram and Zekrom with wrong color schemes. And a closer look at its beta sprites. But now the Swords of Justice have completely different sprites as well, or coloration. Alright, now we have the Forces of Nature over here with their, at least closer to their final designs and not actually their final designs. Alright, the three scratch pads have an alternate unused palette, merged into it for ease of viewing the extra sprites. Originally featured as prototype design. Let's get a closer look at their final designs, as you see here. 3 Tornaduses up here for some reason, 3 times the Tailwind. And one more of them, each of the sprites looking slightly different, especially this last one looking a bit larger. And a closer look at, once again, these beta sprites, but with the wrong color scheme. Alright, originally featured as prototype design for Thundurus. Let's get a closer look at that. And the 3 different Thundurus sprites over here. I guess to make it look like it's floating or something, I don't know. And finally, excuse me, needed to sneeze. Finally, Landorus sprite. Originally featured as prototype design with a strange sepia tone palette. Final versions moves all sprites up by 1 pixel. Or, no, that's why it looks like it's a little larger, just a singular pixel. I thought it was floating for a sec, to be honest with you. We have Beta Landorus over here, as well as all the other Beta Legendary sprites with Landorus's color scheme, or Beta Landorus's color scheme. Alright, next, Cobalion. And you got this design over here, which looks closer to both Virizion and Terrakion with Cobalion's color scheme. Get a closer look at that. I started off featuring a rough, somewhat different looking design that appears to be further along than its prototype's design, seen in the battle sprites, but not quite the finals yet. Once the final design was added, it initially had walking sprites, but those were removed by the next revision. Final versions redraw all the sprites to be much larger with far more detail. Alright, closer look at that. And next up, Verizon Wireless. It started off featuring a rough, somewhat different looking design that appears to be further along than its prototype. Yeah, it's the same thing as Cobalion, but not quite. Once final design is added. Yeah, we don't need to read that same dialogue again. It's the same thing. Alright, once again, these sprites with Verizon Wireless's color scheme and Terrakion with that color scheme again. The Beta Kyurem looks really good with that color scheme, in my opinion. Alright, next up, Terrakion. And Virizion over here with Terrakion's color scheme once again. So now it's likely the same dialogue, so I won't have to read it again. Alright, and finally Keldeo, the best of the Swords of Justice in my personal opinion. Initially used some very rough sprites that are much larger than the finals. Alright, here's this revision. Alright, once again, these beta sprites with Keldeo's color scheme. For whatever reason, I guess they're just testing out some of the color palettes. Tell they're having a bit of fun with it. Alright, and we have Beta Meloetta next. Originally featured Meloetta's prototype design. And it seems to have an unused design for, well, not an unused design for N with Meloetta's color scheme, which actually got a revision to polish it up and add all the necessary animation frames for its small cutscene in the game. It's unknown what the different colors on its head were meant to signify, or if they even initially are intentional. Final design is added in late April, with sprites that all match the poses of the final, but are a bit larger. Some frames have had their eyes opened or closed. I just a closer look at Beta Meloetta's design. And notice how, for its different forms, it would have simply just changed color, which would have been kind of would have been really underwhelming, so I'm glad they changed that. Meloetta is one of the best mythical Pokemon, in my opinion. So, had they just done this, it would have been a lot more lackluster, in my personal opinion. Here's a closer look at more of the sprites with its beta design over here. Anyone else agree that Beta Meloetta kind of looks more like a bug type? Or is it just me? Alright, let's look at one more last set of sprites over here. And like I pointed out, the end sprite before. Alright, now we're done with looking at overworld models. Next up, object sprites. Like the different Pokeballs over here. These look closer to like the Game Boy games, weirdly enough. And then you got one where they reused the sprites from the Gen 4 games. The sprite of the items in the overworld went through several revisions and changes in size. Alright, we don't need to look at them one at a time. It would just take too long if we did. Alright, placeholders was final, not much else. Alright, one of these Pokeballs were used as a rock placeholder, but then in the final, even though you don't see rocks like that in the final game. Aside from, I guess, in front of where you can catch Virizion in Pinwheel Forest, I think that's the only time, that and where you catch Terrakion if you don't catch Cobalion first, is where you find this little rock sprite. That's pretty much it, so I guess this was their placeholder. I mean, it's also very similar to the boulders you see in the Gen 4 games, but not entirely the same, since the strength blocks in this game are completely different to those. Alright, the common cut tree originally used its design from previous games, before changing to a full tree with a single bush at the top of it. It was then changed to have 3 smaller bushes instead. Alright, here's what that looks like. Kind of looking very similar to, the close to the final design. Looks more like the Sudowoodo trees in Heart Gold Soul Silver, kind of. Alright, here's what the tree is originally going to look like. Kind of like the cut tree in the Dream Yard, for example. It's very similar to that. Alright, the white stone, which would have been this generic-looking slab. The stones were originally just bland, flat stones before being made much more unique, and then were made smaller. Alright, I like the design that went here. I kind of would have made more sense if they were a bit larger, to be honest with you. We don't ever, speaking of, they don't ever bring up the white stone or the light stone and the dark stone ever again in later games, which is kind of underwhelming in my opinion. They really should bring it back at some point. Not counting Black and White remakes, obviously, when those inevitably happen, but yeah. Alright, did it to the white stone. Alright, Team Plasma Flag. The Team Plasma Flag had much brighter colors and a whimper waving effect animation. Alright, here's a closer look at some of these. Imagine this during the Accumula City theme, or Accumula Town theme. Alright, and here's another design of them. Here's something closer to the final. Alright, here's another one closer to the final. And here's one last revision. Alright, now presents, apparently. Oh yeah, at the beginning of the game. The present contained a starred Pokemon at the beginning. The game was originally teal and white. It was later changed to green and purple before it's setting on purple and blue. Or green and blue, excuse me. The green and blue looks the best, though the green and purple looks pretty good too. But here's a closer look. And for some reason there's random guys here, I guess, test out the colors of it. Oh, this teal and white one doesn't look half bad either. I like it. But again, I think the final's best. Our trophies, prizes. The subway trophies were brightened up and then given a shine on both the trophies and bows when you defeat the different trophies in game, which, not gonna lie, I didn't know these existed. Alright, since there's too many of them, no need to do a closer look, but here they are. For depending on if you do single battle, double battle, super single, super double, all that. Certificates for completing the Pokedex were touched up, with one being given a silver ribbon and the other being given a gold ribbon. Originally, the one with the gold ribbon just had 2 ribbons instead of 1. In this code here, only one of the certificates was updated. Alright, so many of them do a closer look. So if you want to pause for a sec, please pause. Alright, traffic cones. The traffic cones that block your progress were originally yellow and black instead of orange. Alright, here's what that looks like. Kind of looks like the twisty smoothies from Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, like 13 years before that game. 13 and a half years, actually. That was for when it came out in the US. Alright, here's the final. Alright, the spider web in front of Chargestone Cave before you beat, what's-his-face? Clay. The Ultra Webs in Chargestone Cave went through a number of revisions, and originally had an animation for falling apart. Why didn't they keep that in the final game? That would have been a nice little touch. But here's a closer look at some of its old animations. Looks like one of the Spider-Man webs. Here's another one. Different sprite. Alright, here's a different one with that falling apart animation. Didn't realize that was the same one. Alright, and here's something closer to the final. Alright. Unused grabbed debug sprites. Test NPC over here. A test character dated February 24th, 2009 with that code. Resembles one of the middle-aged men, but with different hair and colors. And here's a closer look at that. I'll just do one of these sprites. The front-facing one. He also looks slightly drunk, too. Our reporters. The reporter and cameraman NPCs from previous games were meant to reappear, just like the ones from the Hoenn games, but never got proper sprites made. Both dated July 9th, 2009. Alright, closer look at that. Weirdly enough, these sprites were made during Heart Soul Silver's development, since those games weren't out yet at the time. Alright, the Sportsman. Unknown sports-related NPC, likely for one of the domes in Nimbasa City, might have been the Jogger from previous games. Dated July 9th, 2009. Here's a closer look at that. Maybe they're originally going to have the Jogger costume. I mean, we do see bikers, so we could have had, and some cyclists and stuff, so we could have had joggers too on a separate route. Alright, the Sportswoman. Same deal as above, dated July 9th, 2009. Here's a closer look. Could have been similar to the triathlon trainer class from the Hoenn games as well. Alright, the Jugglers from the Johto games. Different from the Cloud NPCs, and last appeared in Heart Soul Silver by this point. Might have been deemed as redundant to have alongside the Cloud. Dated July 9th, 2009. Alright, they just use the same sprites as the sprites we saw before. Driver. Unknown scrapped NPC that was either a literal vehicle driver or a golf driver. Why would he be a golf driver? It could have been... I don't know. It could have been a bus driver even. You don't know. Anyways, July 9th, 2009, once again, with the same sprites we saw before. Elite Four 5 to 8. 4 extra slots for the Elite Four were added in July of 2009, making it a total of 8. More like the Elite 8, which doesn't have the same ring to it. It's unknown what these extra slots would have been used for. Maybe a second set of Elite Four. You don't know. Kind of like what we see in the DLCs for Skull and Violet, where you have both the Paldean Elite Four and the Blueberry Academy Elite Four. Could have been something like that. Well, whatever. Here's a closer look at these unused sprites. Alright. Skull. A simple skull sprite. Received a single revision to centralize it, or centerize it. Appeared in the museum for a little while before being removed from the game. Alright, here's a closer look at that. It's kind of similar to a Cubone skull, but not exactly the same. They could have had some extra space for it, but there was already enough scenery in the museum anyway, so maybe they thought it was over-designed or something. Or would have over-designed the museum, or it's just unnecessary to them. There are two different ninja hiding spots, just like in the Hone games, as they appeared in Gen 3. Ninjas appear in the game as members of Team Plasma, but not the common trainer class that actually used these. Alright, dated February 22, 2010. And here's a closer look at the grass ones. Again, just like the ones in the Hone games. They even used the same sprites from the Home games too. So it looks more like it came out of the GBA rather than for the DS, obviously. Likely got scrapped early in development, but originally it was going to be the Ninja class, as you can see here. And finally, base scratchpad. A scratchpad of a bunch of early NPCs, dated November 6, 2009. Includes a unique, large NPC that was never seemingly used as a design for any other NPCs in the game. And here's a closer look at that. Especially the pigtail wearing girl over here that's unused, and some of the other unused sprites over here. Alright, well, with that being said, there's some other unused sprites that I'd like to look at. I think the next time we should do Trainer Battle Sprites. So if y'all enjoyed this edition of Unused Content and Games and you want to see more, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I consider this question today. For all the unused content we went over, what would you like to see in the final game and why? Perhaps beta, for me, perhaps beta Kirim's design, as you can see right over here. Kind of looks like a Monster Hunter to me, but we'll look into that more in a later episode. Alright. Well, if you learned something, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. See you in part 3. Have a barefoot day.